I never imagined my life would take such a peculiar turn, but sometimes, reality surprises you in ways you least expect. My marriage wasn't what it used to be. In the early days, it was filled with passion and excitement, but over time, it turned into a routine, a partnership that felt more transactional than emotional. My husband was a good man, hardworking and dependable, but somewhere along the way, we lost the connection that made our relationship special. I tried to fix things, but nothing seemed to work. Every attempt to rekindle our bond ended with me feeling more alone. He was always preoccupied, work, hobbies, or simply zoning out in front of the TV. I would sit beside him, trying to initiate conversations or suggest spending time together, but his responses were curt, as though I was interrupting something more important. Loneliness became my constant companion. I found myself yearning for the smallest gestures, an affectionate glance, a kind word, or even a moment of undivided attention. When those never came, I turned inward, searching for ways to fill the void. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I began finding solace in small, private escapes. When my nephew came to stay with us, I welcomed the change in atmosphere. He was in his early 20s, confident and full of life. His energy was refreshing, and I enjoyed having someone around who actually noticed me. He was attentive in a way my husband hadn't been for years, and though it wasn't anything inappropriate, his presence reminded me of the kind of connection I missed. Conversations with him were easy and light-hearted. He had a way of making me feel seen, which was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. At first, I told myself it was harmless. He was family, and his kindness was nothing more than that. But deep down, I couldn't ignore how much I looked forward to our interactions. During the day, my husband would retreat to his office or head out for work, leaving the house eerily quiet. My nephew, however, would find time to talk or help around the house. His laughter filled the empty spaces, and his genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings made me realize just how starved I was for attention. I didn't plan for things to change, and I certainly didn't expect them to. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice the subtle shifts in my own emotions. I wasn't falling for my nephew, I knew that much, but his attentiveness was a mirror reflecting the void in my life. It made me question everything I had accepted as normal. It wasn't his fault, nor was it intentional on my part. But his presence made it impossible to ignore the cracks in my marriage, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was at a crossroads. Something needed to change, though I didn't yet know what or how. As days turned into weeks, the dynamic in the house began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. My nephew's presence brought a liveliness that had been absent for so long, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. He had an energy about him that was infectious, a way of making the mundane feel exciting. Whether it was a casual chat over coffee or a shared laugh at a silly TV show, these moments felt like a lifeline. My husband, however, seemed indifferent to the change. He barely acknowledged my nephew's presence beyond polite exchanges, retreating into his familiar patterns of work and detachment. I tried to involve him in the newfound energy in our home, suggesting we all have dinner together or watch a movie, but he declined more often than not. The gap between us felt wider than ever, and for the first time, I stopped blaming myself entirely for it. Spending time with my nephew felt effortless, and I began to notice things about him that I had overlooked before. He was observant and thoughtful, often picking up on my moods without me having to say a word. If I seemed tired, he would suggest I rest while he handled small chores. If I seemed down, he would share stories from his life that always managed to make me smile. It wasn't just his actions but the intention behind them that struck me. One afternoon, as we were talking in the living room, he mentioned noticing how often I seemed to be carrying the weight of the house on my shoulders. His words hit me harder than I expected because they were true. For years, I had been the one trying to hold everything together, pretending everything was fine even when it wasn't. To hear someone else acknowledge it was both validating and unsettling. Our conversations grew deeper as time went on. He asked questions about my life, my dreams, and my regrets, things I hadn't thought about in years. It was liberating to talk about myself without fear of judgment or indifference. My husband never asked those kinds of questions anymore. He barely seemed interested in who I was beyond the roles I played in his life. I tried to keep things in perspective. I reminded myself that my nephew was just being kind, that his attentiveness didn't mean anything more. But I couldn't deny the warmth his words and actions brought into my otherwise cold existence. It was a stark contrast to the emotional isolation I had grown used to, and it made me realize how much I had been missing. Still, I felt conflicted. I knew these feelings were dangerous, not because they were romantic but because they exposed the deep cracks in my life. His kindness wasn't the problem. It was the glaring reminder of how little kindness I received from the person who was supposed to love me most. I was torn between gratitude and guilt, unsure of where this path would lead. It happened on a quiet afternoon when my husband was out of the house. I had settled into a rare moment of solitude, allowing myself to indulge in something I rarely ever had the time or privacy for, an intimate moment to reconnect with myself. It wasn't something I planned, but rather something I had come to rely on to ease the emptiness I felt. I had barely begun when I heard the door creak open. My heart froze as I turned my head to see my nephew standing there, a mixture of surprise and embarrassment flashing across his face. He mumbled an apology and quickly left, closing the door behind him. I sat there stunned, my face burning with shame and my mind racing. The awkwardness that followed was unbearable. I didn't know how to face him, and for a while I avoided him altogether, retreating to my room or finding excuses to stay out of sight. But avoiding the situation only heightened the tension. He, on the other hand, seemed to handle it with remarkable composure, giving me the space I clearly needed. A few days later, he approached me when we were alone in the kitchen. His voice was calm and his tone carried no judgment as he said, "I'm sorry about the other day. I should have knocked." His words took me by surprise. He wasn't blaming me, nor was he making it more awkward than it already was. I didn't know what to say at first, but eventually, I managed to apologize as well. "It wasn't your fault," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I should have been more careful." He nodded, his expression gentle and understanding. It struck me how mature he was for his age, how he handled a situation that could have easily spiraled into something messy with such grace. That moment of understanding between us brought a strange sense of closure. But it also forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. The incident wasn't just an accident. It was a symptom of the deeper issues in my life. I realized how far I had gone to seek comfort in ways that filled the void, even temporarily. It wasn't about the act itself but what it symbolized, the absence of intimacy and emotional connection in my marriage. As the days passed, my nephew and I resumed our usual interactions, though there was an unspoken understanding between us. He never brought up the incident again, and neither did I. But his kindness didn't waver. If anything, it became even more evident that he saw me not just as an aunt but as a person who deserved compassion and respect. This shift made me reflect deeply on what I wanted from my life. I couldn't keep living in a state of denial, pretending that the cracks in my marriage weren't there. Something had to change, not because of what had happened with my nephew, but because of what it revealed about the life I had been settling for. The days following that awkward but honest conversation were surprisingly calm. It felt as though a weight had been lifted, not because the situation was easy to forget, but because it had forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding for years. For the first time in a long time, I felt the urgency to take control of my life rather than letting it drift aimlessly. I began by reflecting on my marriage. Not just the ways it had failed me but also the ways I had contributed to its stagnation. It was easy to blame my husband for his indifference, but I had also stopped trying, retreating into my own world rather than fighting for what we once had. Still, acknowledgement didn't equate to resolution. The reality was that I wasn't sure if our relationship was salvageable, or if either of us truly wanted to put in the effort anymore. My nephew, to his credit, remained respectful and supportive. He didn't treat me any differently, and his steady presence gave me a sense of stability during a time of emotional turmoil. He became a sounding board, though never directly about my marital struggles. His insights about life, relationships, and finding one's happiness resonated deeply with me, even if they weren't explicitly about my situation. I knew I couldn't rely on him or anyone else to fix what was broken. This was my journey, and any changes had to come from within. I started to focus on myself in ways I hadn't in years. I picked up hobbies I had long abandoned, began journaling to process my thoughts, and even signed up for a yoga class at a nearby studio. These small steps felt empowering, as if I were slowly reclaiming parts of myself I had forgotten existed. Eventually, I decided to have an honest conversation with my husband. It wasn't easy, and I spent days rehearsing what I wanted to say. When the moment finally came, I laid everything out. My feelings of loneliness, the disconnection between us, and my desire for something to change. His reaction was a mix of surprise and defensiveness, but as the conversation went on, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. We didn't resolve everything that night, but it was a start. He admitted that he had noticed the distance between us but didn't know how to bridge it. We agreed to try counseling, though I was cautious about setting my expectations too high. What mattered was that we were finally acknowledging the problem instead of ignoring it. As for my nephew, his visit eventually came to an end. Before he left, he gave me a hug and said, "Take care of yourself, okay?" His words stayed with me, a gentle reminder that I owed it to myself to pursue happiness, regardless of what the future held. Looking back, that moment of intrusion had been a turning point. Not because of the embarrassment it caused, but because of the clarity it forced me to confront. It was a wake-up call, one that set me on a path toward rediscovering who I was and what I truly deserved.